Hello, everybody. Welcome to the How to Craft Your Best Personal Statement webinar with Med School Tutors. I'm Dr. Timothy Dyster, and we're going to go through some big picture philosophies for the personal statement and some really practical tips tonight. And I hope that they're helpful as you engage in this journey toward medical school. I'm certainly excited to be here with you. So to start off, I thought it would make sense to talk a little bit about what we'll be covering. And I do hope that throughout the session, you'll see me occasionally looking to the right, and that's because I'm going to be looking at the chat feed to see questions you have in real time and help with them. So the agenda, of course, saves those for the end, but throughout, if things come up, I would love to hear from you and to give you the advice you need as an individual. So we'll start off today talking a little bit about who we are and who I am, go over some ground rules that I think you can apply to the entire medical school admission process, talk a little bit about where you are in the process, specifically with regards to your personal statement, and then we'll talk a little bit about drafting a personal statement. And things that can often come up are determining the scope of what should be included, and then figuring out what phase of writing you're in and picking a strategy that's tailored to that phase. We'll then talk a little bit about some writing best practices. And then we'll talk about what's, I think, for some students and for many of mine, the hardest part of the writing process, which is handling mixed opinions about your writing. And then again, we'll end with a dedicated period for question and answer, although I would love to hear your questions throughout. So let's start off with who are we at Med School Tutors. So this is a phenomenal group of educators who do one-on-one online tutoring. And this runs from pre-med coursework through MCAT and all the way to residency and boards. I've even done an ICU boot camp for a medicine resident. So we really do like to stick with our students throughout the entirety of their journey to medicine, and even once they've entered into the field. We have over 15 years of experience with many student success stories. And again, we are a group of educators, and all of us are right alongside there with you. So it's pre-med, med students, residents, and attendings who really love to teach and feel passionate about meeting individuals where they are, figuring out what works best for them, and then taking them to the best performance they can have on whatever is in front of them. So who am I as an individual? So I've done several hundreds of hours of tutoring and individual consultant work for Med School Tutors. And that reminds me to also mention that one of the things we do beyond just tutoring is do individual consulting across those phases of application, which is what brings you here tonight. I've worked for MST for over 5 years and have had a wonderful time being a part of this family. And I actually am also a prior medical school admissions board member. So I've been in the room where it happens and listened to people talk about things like what made a personal statement good or not good. And I'll be drawing on some of those experiences tonight, in addition to a really robust background in writing. And then I myself am a practicing physician. I am currently based in San Francisco. I'm a chief resident of internal medicine. And I'm really excited again to be here tonight. So starting with some ground rules that I think can be applied to this entire process of application. The number one rule is to always be honest and accurate. So when you're putting together this application, of course, you want to put your best self forward, but you want to put forward yourself. And that means taking the experiences that you've worked really hard to have, thinking about what they meant to you, and representing them honestly and accurately. Of course, always presenting them in the best possible light, but never doing anything that feels like you're bending the truth. That is just a no-go. And as a physician, someday you'll need to be honest and accountable. And so it's really important to start that practice now. Another ground rule for the application process is that you're going to have mixed opinions throughout. This is especially true for the personal statement. And as I said, we'll talk a little bit about that closer to the end of our time together. And then the final piece is really that advising needs to be individualized. So this is also especially true for the personal statement, which by its nature is personal, but it's really hard to give blanket advice. And you'll see what I'm doing tonight to kind of bridge that gap is I'll be pushing you to think about yourself as an individual from a menu of options. And this will be the way that you can tailor this, even though, of course, this webinar is for multiple people, unlike when I work with my students one-on-one and really give them individualized, dedicated advice for them. So let's start off by talking about where you are in your personal statement process. And the way that I'd like to do that is to have you respond in the chat with where you are in the writing process. And I think of this as a consultant in four major buckets. So thinking about your personal statement, and then there's one of two spaces that are the big buckets. Are you not started or have you started? And then within being not started, there's two subdivisions. So some people who haven't started feel like they can't start. They don't know where to even begin in their writing process. And then there's others who haven't started, but they feel like they're ready. They just, for whatever reason, haven't gotten around to it yet. If you have started your personal statement, I separate this again into two big buckets. So have you begun to write, so you have an early outline or a draft or even like a list of topics, versus have you gotten feedback and do you have a polished draft? And so I'm interested in the chat, and you can write it to the panelists and it'll just be received by me, whether you're started or not started, and then which of these other categories describe you. Okay, not started, have an early draft, great. Not started and feeling unable to start. And that is a super normal experience. So, you know, I see the sad wink emoji, and I hear where you're coming from, but it's totally normal. And that's what we're here to help you with. I love this. So we have the full house of the places people can be in our group tonight. And that's going to be awesome, because that means for each of you, I'll be able to offer a little bit of, as I said, mini individualized advice, not quite as good as working directly with a consultant, but I still hope I can meet each of you where you're at. So thinking about drafting the personal statement as a big activity, let's go through those two parts of it that I mentioned. And let's start with thinking about determining the scope of your personal statement. So overall, the personal statement should answer the question, why do I want to be a physician and apply to medical school? And it should be personal. Maybe that seems like silly to say out loud, but I think it's an important thing that sometimes students really grapple with when they're applying to medical school. That being said, the personal statement is also a professional document. And so I'll say that these boundaries are really fuzzy at times. And I think when I work with my students, we often grapple with this together. How do they bring their full self into a personal statement while still being able to show up for the professional boundaries that are required whenever you put forward a professional application? And so the rule of thumb that I would give you, and again, I hope that you can take this and make it work for you as an individual, is to exclude anything from the personal statement that would make you uncomfortable if it came up in an interview setting. And this is a pretty personal question to ask yourself. Some people, for example, have experiences with family members being sick, and that's what led them to want to be a physician. And the question I would encourage you to ask yourself is just, would you feel comfortable discussing that in an interview? It's okay if you could only discuss it briefly. For example, you can always say, that experience is really emotionally meaningful for me, so I would love to talk with you about it. I'm going to keep my comments brief to reflect that. But if it's something that really, really hurts to think back to, that may be something to keep out. And similarly, there are maybe other facets of your personal life that are things that are cherished and dear to you, but like you would not want to talk about in a professional setting. And those boundaries are for you to set, again, as an individual and a person. And I think if you use this rule of thumb, you'll make good choices for designing your personal statement while keeping it personal. I would say that content that's common includes formative experiences, so things that were really, really important to your growth as an individual. Clinical experiences, so how have you come to know what it means to be a physician and what do you see it meaning to you in the future? And then your proudest moments and accomplishments. Sometimes things that are unrelated to medicine still tell a story about who we are and can be really, really useful for expressing ourselves in a written document like the personal statement. So a common question that I get from my students, though, is, well, what are medical students looking for? And I want to come back to our ground rule of being our best selves and putting a self that we're proud of and that we've shown in the best possible way forward. So I would say that the question, what are medical schools looking for, might be a little bit misguided. There are personal characteristics that are relevant to medicine that you might hope to capture through talking about experiences that are meaningful to you. But at the end of the day, this really is about capturing who you are and what you will bring as a personal identity to medical training. So things that you might think about trying to highlight through the examples you give are things, though, like a strong work ethic, intellectual curiosity, sustained passion. And this last one's really important, mature decision-making. And that includes, why did you choose to apply to medical school? Why are you entering the medical field? And when I say mature decision-making, what I mean is that you've considered other options, thought about what life would be like in a different field. And if you haven't done that, that there was a reason that you didn't consider other options. And this is where the personal statement, of course, is a writing activity, but it's also an activity in reflecting on yourself and really thinking about what is driving me in this pursuit, which is an incredibly fulfilling road to be on and still a long one. And then I think that it's also important to highlight that this feature of mature decision-making, and medical schools do talk about this. Does the student who's applying understand what they're getting themselves into? Really, the best place to capture it is the personal statement. Your CV having clinical exposure definitely helps and is super, super important, but it's in the personal statement that you articulate why you want to do this, why you are on this long road. And so it's super important that you've figured that out for yourself and that you come up with good language to describe it. Another question that comes up a lot is, can my personal statement include narrative elements? And the answer is yes. Not all statements do. And I would say that having the entire personal statement be just a story would be a little bit difficult to accomplish what you need to in the personal statement. But if there's a vignette or a memory or a moment that you want to include as a piece of evidence for what brought you to medicine, that's absolutely acceptable. And then what I would say, though, as a caveat is, if you're going to include stories in your personal statement, really, really attend to the language you're using. I think there's often a temptation when telling a story to use big words and fancy words and to paint a picture. And what I would say is it's always better to go back to the best fit word. If the best fit word is a simple word, I promise you it will read better than a fancy one that you looked up in a dictionary and maybe haven't ever used before. Understanding how to use language is super important in conveying a clear voice when writing. So in order for us to make this a little bit pragmatic, because again, I know I'm expressing ideas and tools, is I wanted you to think about what I would refer to as your own emerging professional brand, because this is a piece of what you're capturing in your personal statement is how is the person I am becoming a professional, and how will who I am translate into the role of a physician. And so what I want us to do is just take a couple of minutes, and I'm going to split this up into two halves. And so I will let you know when about a minute has passed. And I want you to brainstorm first up to 5 of your proudest or most meaningful accomplishments. And then once you've generated that list for yourself, and totally feel free to share it with me, I'm happy to be the stranger. I want you to imagine handing this list to a stranger. What themes might they see? What might they think about you based on these experiences that you're proud of? So let's go ahead and take just a couple minutes there. I'm going to come over here and open my clock. And so I'll tell you when 60 seconds has passed, and then I'll look forward to seeing the chat if you're interested in sharing, and otherwise you can reflect on your own. And so again, what I would encourage you to do is to think about returning to this activity later, because thinking about what you're proudest of is going to help you think about authentically who you are as a young professional and help you convey that message in a personal statement in a compelling way that is authentic to you. And I will tell you that something I haven't mentioned yet is the best kept secret is the personal statement in so many ways is the launching pad for your medical school interviews. So what you choose to write about is going to almost inevitably become a part of how you're being assessed by the medical school. And that means that you have the ability to direct that conversation towards things that you feel natural and at your best talking about if you find ways to include them here. So it's a time well spent to figure this piece of things out. So the next thing I want to talk about is the actual phases of writing. And then by each of those phases, what are strategies that will work well for you in trying to advance where you are in that writing process? So again, we're going to go back to those 4 buckets. And I know that we are running the gambit here in terms of where people are. But let's say that you're one of those people who said, I have nothing written, but I feel ready to start. That's great. The best thing to do here is to set a clear deadline for your first draft. So just pick a time that you think it's realistic to have something drafted or outlined. And then it can go a really long way to have someone who's going to keep you accountable to that deadline. Deadlines we set for ourselves tend to get pushed down the road a little bit. So think about notifying a friend, a partner, a family member, someone who you trust as a mentor of the deadline you've set for yourself and ask them to help keep you accountable. If you're in this second category, and again, I just want to say it's so normal, and this happens so many times. I've worked with so many students one-on-one who are in this space. If you have nothing written and you're unable to start, then I would suggest that there's a number of techniques you can use to get yourself going. So let's talk through those here, because I know this is a common issue that comes up, and I know that it can feel really, really daunting. So one technique that I've used successfully with some of my students is I actually will have them write using a stream of consciousness method. So what does that mean? It means that you sit down with a piece of paper, and much like journaling, you just write. and you don't burden yourselves with having the right exact perfect words come out, with having maybe even the grammar of your sentences be following the strictest rules. It's really about taking what's in your mind and just going and not stopping. And so you may consider in that case setting a timer and doing it for a certain period of time and just seeing what comes out. And I would encourage you to use one of these two questions in doing that, or to do this activity for both. The first one is, when did I realize I wanted to be a physician? And the second one is, why do I want to apply to medical school now? And I think what you'll find is that you may, in thinking to yourself in this focused way under a timer and just letting your thoughts move freely, that you are able to articulate the broad strokes that can become the foundation for your personal statement, even if, of course, it's going to require editing and thinking about how to change it into a paragraph structure. It is still something that will get something on the page and get you started. A second technique that I've used successfully with a number of my students is to have them list titles for the most meaningful experiences they've had throughout their lives. And I know that today I've invited you to do that with up to 5. When I talk to my students about this, I don't put a limit on it. I would say just sit down and think, what are all the things that have happened, the stories that come to my mind when I think, what is meaningful to me, what has made me proud? And then, like I said, generate a title for each of those. Once you've done that, look at the list and mark ones that feel like they would be important or salient to the decision you've made to apply to medical school. Or if they didn't necessarily make you apply to medical school, like for example, let's say that you have done a really high level of music performance or a really high level of athletic performance, you could still mark that and see how that would inform your work as a physician, because it demonstrates that you are someone who's dedicated to a craft, who practices something even at the beginning when it's hard and you're not good at it, until you get to a place of having skill. A third technique, and this one's a little bit harder, and I will say works a lot better if you're working with a professional consultant, but that you could definitely try with someone at home, is to ask a trusted friend or loved one to do an interview with you and to take notes on themes. And so you could ask them to ask you questions relevant to this idea of applying to medical school. And then if you go to do that and it doesn't work, another way you can do it if you're not working with a professional consultant would be to ask these people you care about, what have you told them about your desire to become a physician? What have the conversations been about? What are the things that if you asked them, why do you think I want to be a physician? What would they guess based on the things that you've talked about together in the past? This, of course, is outsourcing the personal statement a bit. So it's important to take those reflections and decide for yourself, do they feel right and do they feel authentic? But again, if you're really struggling to get started, this can help you start to think about things that maybe you tell other people, even if you're having a hard time saying them out loud to yourself when you go to sit down and write. And so again, all of these are good ways to kind of break through that writer's block. And what I have found in my work with students and even with medical students who are applying to residency and need to write a personal statement is that this process of getting the first step going is really important. And ultimately, by taking it, many people find that they're then in the writing process, and that with a little bit of coaching, they can keep advancing and really build a personal statement that is effective. If you have started to write things down, what I really want you to think about once you have a draft is, what do I need from my proofreaders when I send it to them? So if you have a super early version of your personal statement, I would say send it to someone you trust, but ask them to talk about the overall structure. Are the paragraphs in the right order? Do the paragraphs have a logical flow? The length, does it feel like it's about right? And to ask for themes. Again, I think one of the really powerful things about having someone proofread is that it allows you to, in some cases, have them name to you and reflect to you what you're saying without realizing you're saying it. And so you could ask them a question like, I'd be interested what your impression of me would be after reading this personal statement. What qualities or characteristics do you think I would have based on the experiences I've described here or the stories that I've told? If you've done many, many rounds of edits and you feel good about where your personal statement is at, and this will come back to that idea of mixed opinions, is that I want you to be really clear with your proofreader. If you have run this by 5 or 6 or 7 people and you feel good about it, and what you want from them is to be a copy editor and for them to look at your grammar, to look at your punctuation, to look at your word choice, I want you to reach out to people with very, very clear intentions, because there's nothing worse than going through the process getting your personal statement to a place where all it needs is that final okay, and having someone want you to totally restructure it. It can really shake up your confidence about your application. And as we'll talk about, just because one person feels that way doesn't actually mean that their opinion is right. So again, we'll come back to this idea, but I want you to be really intentional if you have a drafted statement with who you access for proofreading and what you ask them to do. So I know that some of you have started to draft your personal statement, and I would still say that almost all of us have writer's block at some point in our lives. And so I would still encourage you to think about trying out this new technique with the group. If you're one of those people who told me, you know what, I'm really struggling to get started, I really, really want you to actually engage in this for the next couple of minutes. I think it's the most powerful thing that I could do for you as an individual during our seminar together. And so I want you to experiment with one of these strategies for getting started. And so technique one, as a reminder, is to write using a stream of consciousness method, answering either when did I realize I wanted to be a physician, or why do I want to apply to medical school? If you're not feeling up for that for whatever reason, then what I would encourage you to do is go back to that list you made for the first activity we did, and I want you to build it out. You can go past 5, just list as many of these titles that you can think of for meaningful experiences you had. And then I want you to start thinking as you do that about reviewing the list and marking the ones that feel like they matter for your medical school application. So let's go ahead and start that 2 minutes now. Okay, that's about 2 minutes. Would anyone be willing to share with me in the chat your list or your brainstorm? And while you're thinking about doing that, I'm going to answer one of the questions that's come up. So Jeannie, thanks so much for asking, do students need to write about the specific moment they wanted to become a physician and explicitly write that this was the moment they wanted to, or can it be more subtle? That's a really great question. Absolutely, you do not have to be able to crystallize it to a single moment. I think that you can write about the way that you came to that decision more subtly and organically, as you've asked about. And so for some people, there was a specific moment, and that's great because that's like, it can be a very easy story for them to tell in a clear way. But there are people for whom it felt like a choice that they considered, and they thought about other careers, and it may be a whole confluence of factors that leads to your decision, and that's just as valid. So absolutely tell the story, as I said, accurately in the way it happened, and that's always the right way to do it. Oh, I love this. So someone has submitted for technique 1. I realized I wanted to be a doctor when I was performing a partial laryngectomy on a cadaver during my anatomy and physiology course in college. I love that. So this is a great personal statement sentence, and you may choose later to change the way that it's phrased if you decide you want to make edits. But what I really like about this is there's this sense of narrative, what we would call narrative pull in writing. So in this one sentence, I have immediately all these curiosities about, what did you study in college? What got you into a cadaver lab before you even came to medical school? How did they incorporate procedural aspects into that coursework? And I think, again, this is a great example of a time where there was a crystallized moment. And so wonderful to include that in the statement. But again, if you don't have a single moment you can point back to, that is just as valid. Personal statements, there's no right way to do it, as long as you're being honest and putting forth your best self to answer the question, why do you want to be a physician? So I really appreciate those of you who have had questions and have shared. Please do keep them coming into the chat. So I wanted to talk a little bit about writing best practices. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, when you actually go to write and to do some of your own maybe first pass editing, what are some rules you can use to guide that? So one rule that I think is often not something students think about is the overall structure of the essay. And so when you think about kind of a paragraph, I want you to think of it as taking you back maybe to an English course you've taken before. I want you to think about the paragraph as being a few to several lines long, but not like 12 or 14 sentences, which would be too long. And that the paragraph should have thematic coherence. So it should be talking about an idea pretty consistently throughout. Similarly, there's sometimes this temptation in writing to use what we call staccato paragraphs. That's a reference to music where a note is hit and then passed over very quickly. And this is what a staccato paragraph is. It's like 1 to 2 sentences You can use these in writing, and the personal statement is a flexible enough form to use something like this, but it's really dramatic. Staccato paragraphs have a ton of oomph, and so you'd really want to make sure that that effect is warranted. And we'll talk about this again at the level of word choice. For paragraph structure, so within a paragraph, if you read it and it feels like it's not sounding right, and I would encourage you, even though it's a written document, to read it out loud to yourself when you proofread. That'll help you catch errors before you send it to a trusted proofreader, but it'll also give you a better sense of the rhythm of what you've written. And if you're doing that and the rhythm feels funky in some way, what I encourage you to do is go through a paragraph and look at the length of the sentences. Something that professional writers do well, and because they've honed their craft, is that they do vary the sentence length, and it creates a rhythm for the paragraph and a feeling for the paragraph. And so that's something you can try to attend to and think about editing or changing if the paragraph, when you read it out loud to yourself, seems like it doesn't have a good rhythm. And then thinking about within the sentence and thinking about word choices, it's a classic rule, but do use the active voice. If you're going to use the passive voice for some reason, have a really, really good reason that you've chosen to do it. It's almost always better to speak in that strong active voice when writing any sort of document you're submitting as a young professional. And then I implied this before, and it comes back to that same idea of using a staccato paragraph if it's warranted, is use best fit words rather than the fanciest ones possible. So of course, if you have an outstanding vocabulary, use it. Look for the right word to describe what you're saying. And try to avoid using just generic terms throughout your personal statement. But if the right word to describe what you're describing is a simple one, like want or like, that's okay. You don't have to use super fancy words in the personal statement. You want it to be professional, but you also want it to read well. And fancy words are something that you want to use sparingly because they draw a lot of focus. So I want to address this point, and I do see that there are more questions coming in the chat, so I'll go through this and then we'll kind of open into a period of active discussion together. So thinking about how to handle mixed opinions. So I can't say this enough. Personal statements are highly variable in their content. There is absolutely no right way to write them other than to ensure that they have proper spelling and that proper grammar is used. This means that one person may read a personal statement and think that its content is absolutely fantastic, and then another person may read the same statement and find that it's not very engaging. This is just a feature of what people feel drawn to in writing and what they feel drawn to in the descriptions of other people's experiences, and there's nothing we can do to change it. And so this means that you should anticipate when you bring your statement to different people that you will get conflicting opinions when asking people about your statement. No, don't get me wrong. If you bring it to 4 or 5 people and they all have more or less the same thing to say, it's very possible that something about your statement is conveying a specific message or has a specific area for improvement that you would not want to ignore. That being said, if you show it to 5 or 6 people and 5 people love it and the 6th person's like, this is not the experience I would have written about, I think that that's one of those points where you can take it with a grain of salt, take what is good from it to make the statement stronger, but don't fall into the trap of feeling like, oh, if I don't please everybody I ever show this to, something about it is flawed or wrong. And this comes back again to that point of once you have something written and you're asking for proofreading, knowing what you're asking for when you send that document for feedback to whoever you're trusting with your work. And I would just emphasize for those of you who do writing, this is a really normal part of the writing process. If you ever have the chance to go to a writing workshop, I'd encourage you to do that. It is very common that people have multiple different opinions. And the one thing I would say is no matter what the feedback a person gives you is, so if you do, for example, if you ended up hopping on the phone to talk about the feedback, or if you got an email that had feedback that wasn't what you were hoping for, something that's always valuable, no matter what, is to ask someone, again, what themes do you see in my personal statement? And if you read this personal statement, who would you think I was? What would you think of me based on it? This is a great question to ask people. Of course, people who know us will have preformed opinions. And so that means also to think about your resources. So locally, if your college does have a writing center, or if there's a program where a peer, for example, will read your essay and not know you, that's a great resource for you. Similarly, we do have many other resources that are relevant to this process. So if you do visit our website at Med School Tutors, you will see that there's actually a tab that's resources, and some of those are free resources. So if you are at a university or college that doesn't offer resources to you for free as a student, we are doing our best to give some of those on our website to make sure that you're set up with success to launch. Similarly, if you're listening to this webinar and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I could really use some help, we would love that. We love working with students. And so I would encourage you again to visit the website and to think about meeting with one of our student relations team members who can take you through the process of, first of all, getting to know you and getting to know a little bit about your style, and then connecting you with someone who can help you in whatever ways you need along this journey. And so with that, I would say, again, we have a process that we use to bring new students into our family and to connect them with the people who are going to be most likely to set them up for success. Our student relation team members think really hard about the individual tutor's styles and do an intake chat with you to figure out what yours is, to try to make the best possible match between you and whoever you're paired with. And you do get a chance to meet your expert tutor. There is a trial session that's half off. And then there's a process by which the team will finalize a plan with you for an overall package. And again, we really like supporting our students. And I think one of the most exciting parts of our company is the way that it works all across the spectrum. And again, as I said, we've supported people at all phases of their training. I love it. Sometimes my students will text me on their match day, like years after we've worked together. And it is a super, super fulfilling thing. And so if you choose to go the tutoring route, we do things like custom study schedules, adaptive tutoring sessions, where again, the techniques are meant to fit you. We really, really aim to communicate super regularly. We know that when you need support, it's really important to get it in a timely way. And then we do have a very robust system of onboarding our tutors, giving them mentors to make sure they're growing. And I think it does make us really some of the best and most invested group in doing this sort of work with students. And as you know from the session today, we do offer, in addition, coursework tutoring. We do med school admission advisement. We do one-time strategic planning sessions. And we also do consulting and advising for people applying to residency. So again, we'd love to have you be part of our family for the entirety of your journey. And so I'm going to go ahead and have this transition into the question part of the session. And so I see here, if this hasn't been covered yet, would you recommend addressing any setback or hardship, and how would you suggest addressing them? That is a great, great, great question. I will say that that's one that is better answered one-on-one, because the specifics of what the hardship were really are what make it something that should or should not be included in this portion of the application. I will answer a part of that question that I can answer in a generic way, which is to say that if you have a hardship that is something you feel informs your character, so it's something you overcame, an obstacle that you worked hard to get past, that is always, always relevant. And I would say that the one thing I would come back to is that rule of thumb we talked about. So is this hardship something that if in a professional setting, when I'm in my suit and maybe on Zoom, maybe in person, we'll see how the world shakes out after the pandemic, would I be okay with someone asking me about this and maybe asking a couple of follow-up questions? And if the idea of that hardship coming into that interview space makes you uncomfortable, then I would encourage you to think hard before including it in the personal statement. I think that's probably, again, as far as I can take the answer in a generic way. And again, that is the kind of really awesome question that a tutor could help you think about, or a consultant, excuse me, could help you think about longitudinally, or even could help you think about in a strategic planning session. Well, thank you again so much for spending the evening with me. It's super, super helpful. I hope for you to have spent this time. It was super, super fun for me to spend the time with you, even virtually. And I hope again that this is something that no matter where you were in your writing process, you could take something away from it. And that if you were one of those people who was unable to start, that we gave you the little bit of nudge and support you needed tonight to get your process started. And again, we would love to work with you longitudinally and be a part of your journey. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a good rest of the night.